Today we are going to dig, divide, and store all of the garden dahlias for the fall now that we've had a couple frosts. Thankfully, I have found my good clippers, which may have spent the last 2 weeks in the compost pile. We're going to brush over that. The dahlias in question are in two 8x4 raised beds, so there are probably less than 20, so this shouldn't take too long. There are two different types of dahlias that I have in these beds. I have 7 or 8 little border dahlias that I actually grew from seed. So these will be first year tubers since the plants were grown from seed this year. And then in the back half of this bed and the entire bed behind it are cutting dahlias, so bigger varieties, named varieties that have been grown from tubers that I saved from last year. Now these look terrible because they have been hit with multiple frosts, so now is definitely the time to dig them up. And it will be really interesting to see the difference in tubers from these small seed-grown dahlias here to the bigger ones that have been grown from tubers. So here are two that I have already dug up. I have what I think is Cafe au Lait right here, and then I have Wizard of Oz on this side. And so far, these clumps look pretty good. There's some good tubers here. I expected more out of the Cafe au Lait, but maybe that's just because the flowers are so big on this variety that you expect the tubers to be really big too, and that's not always the case. I wouldn't always take all the soil off of these. I have stored them just like this because all that extra soil does help to keep the moisture in, and you don't want these to dry out completely. But I am finding a lot of worms in here, and I don't really want to store the worms with the dahlias. And then this one is the Wizard of Oz. So the clump itself doesn't look all that much smaller, but Wizard of Oz is a much smaller ball type dahlia. It's very small flowers, especially compared to the Cafe au Lait, but I love them. They are the most adorable little pink things. So all of these dahlias were planted from clumps of tubers that I stored from last year, and last year was a terrible year for dahlias. I didn't really want to disturb the clumps by dividing them. A lot of them weren't really worth dividing anyway, so I planted them as is. That means that they're definitely going to need some dividing this year. And not all of them are labeled either. Some of them were in such sorry condition that they didn't even really flower all that much. When I planted them in the spring, I didn't know what was what, so I was sticking labels in the ground as I noticed them flowering this year, and I'm sure I missed some. So we're going to have some named varieties and some mystery dahlias that I will try my best to identify next year. But I did rip out any plants as I saw them that I didn't want to keep, so I know that everything that is left in these beds are definitely flowers that I want to keep for next year. So the next thing I'm going to do is cut down the remaining foliage and dig up these clumps of tubers, and then we'll see what we have to work with. Here is the very last one. I planted 30 dahlia clumps at the start of the year, and I have 23 good ones here. A few of them were a little bit rotten when I dug them up, so I'm not going to bother saving those. I have the ones that I did manage to tag the varieties over here, and these are all the unnamed ones. So they're going to go in 2 separate crates. And the border dahlias, I had 7 of them, and I'm happy to report that they do make adorable little tiny clumps of tubers. These things are really small. They're not very big at all. This one right here is the biggest clump I got, and this one is the smallest one. The other 5 all fit somewhere in between. You could very easily store this. I am going to clip the tops off, and luckily they're all very small. I'll be able to fit all 7 of these border dahlia tubers into one small box. And to compare them to some of these big cutting varieties, this one right in front of me is one of the smaller clumps. The tubers are very much shorter and rounder on this border dahlia, and these ones are much longer, which is typical of most of the ones that I grow. So here in zone 6, I have to dig up my dahlias because they are not completely hardy. I have seen people in zone 5 and 6 overwinter their dahlias, but it takes a pretty deep covering of mulch. Ideally, fairly dry soil, a good foot of mulch, and then a tarp over the top of that even. But from what I've seen, the survival rate still is not great, and I can usually get close to 100% survival by overwintering them indoors. So I only have 23 of these taller ones and 7 shorter ones. That's 30. That's not a whole lot. It took me less than an hour to dig up all of these. So for that amount, the digging and storing of them is no big deal as long as you have the space to do so. But for today, where this soil is pretty wet, I'm going to put these in bulb crates and put them in my greenhouse for a couple of days to dry out a little bit before I store them. There, these are the last 4, and we will come back in a couple of days once these have dried out a little bit. We'll see if we can clear some off and maybe have a look at dividing one of them so you can see the process. I'm not convinced I'm going to divide all of them in the fall, and any that are still on the smaller side I'm not going to touch, but I would like to divide a couple of them and maybe show you the process at least. So, see you in a couple of days. Well, I should have seen this coming, but at least the dahlias are out of the ground. Today is one of those days where the greenhouse door is going to get closed while I'm in here. That doesn't happen that often. We are safely in the greenhouse now. It is still snowing outside. I brought my coffee. It has been a couple of days because life. Oh, this time of year is always busy. I brought 2 clumps with me. One that I left completely as is. So I'm trying not to knock off too much of the soil because I'm going to store this one exactly as is. One year I washed all of the dirt off my tubers and stored them. I found they got fairly desiccated and it took a lot of time and a lot of water, and it's really not necessary. So most of the time I just store them exactly like this. So the soil here is a little bit damp. That is perfectly fine. I let them dry inside for a couple of days. And then I'm just going to lightly wrap them in newspaper and store them in bulb crates just like this. As I'm doing that, I'm going to have a look at all the tubers to make sure none of them are rotten or have any significant damage. This is just a broken root. I'm going to clip off all of these smaller roots here because we don't need those, and the tubers will very quickly grow new ones in the spring. So this is one of my unnamed tubers. And the second one I brought out, I did actually wash off just so that we could have a really good look at it. And I chose a good one because it looked like I jammed this one with my fork while I was digging. There's a little bit of damage right there and right there. And if this callus is over, that will likely be perfectly fine. This tuber, though, is significantly older looking than the other ones. I suspect it was one of the original ones. The problem is I can't get clippers in there close enough to be able to cut that one out. And oh, look at that. Look at that. I just solved that problem. It just snapped right off. That was easy. So at this point, all I need to do is snip off these small roots. They're going to completely dry out and not be any use next year. Here's a good example of a broken tuber. This one is not going to do anything, so I'm just going to cut that right off. So when we have a clump of tubers and we want to divide them, now these tubers are very small, so I'm not going to do that, but what we're looking for is where the tuber connects to the neck, which is that part, and an eye. And what oh look, this one's snapped too. So if the tuber is broken below that neck, it is not capable of producing shoots at that point. There, so sometimes in the fall you can see the eyes. It looks like we have eyes right there, just slightly swollen tiny little bumps right there. So you would want to cut this guy right up here. Here's another example. There are what look like eyes right there. And I'm very much not an expert at this. So with this one, there is no soil around it to hold the moisture in. You'll want to wrap it up. If you're in a very dry climate, maybe in totes. I've seen plastic wrap used, but I really don't like to create that much plastic waste. You can wrap them in newspaper individually and then put them in a plastic container. That would work very well. And that goes for our dirty tuber here as well. I'm going to leave that exactly like that. I'm going to store that loosely wrapped in old newspaper in bulb crates, and I'll just keep an eye on them to make sure that they're not drying out too much, because we can always add a little bit of water to this soil here to help it hold in moisture until the time comes to plant. Now, it's easy to forget that in some climates, dahlias are actually perennial plants and they stay dormant in the ground during the coldest part of the year. And they're not going to be completely bone dry in the ground. They need to maintain a certain amount of moisture. The trick is just keeping that moisture at the proper level where it won't rot your tubers or create any disease problems, but not so dry that they start to shrivel. So with that, the tubers that I have should fill about 3 to 4 bulb crates, and I'll put those away for the winter and check on them every 4 to 6 weeks or so. Now I say that, but I don't think I remember to check on them once until March last year. So the lesson there is don't stress yourself too much over the exact details. Not too wet, not too dry. Don't let them freeze, don't let them bake, and they should be perfectly fine. And this is the last time that I'm going to sit on the floor of this greenhouse, because that is very much my next project. I am embarking on a complete indoor greenhouse renovation. I've already cleaned and power washed the heck out of it in here. There were so many spider webs. As I say that, I'm looking at a slug. I don't know where he came from. I have kind of missed sitting here in the greenhouse watching it snow outside. I think I'm going to take advantage of it not being freezing and snowing in here and start working on this floor. And I cannot wait to show you what I'm going to do with that. Thank you so much for watching. Get those dahlias put away safe before it snows where you are, and I'll see you next time.